It's time for The Verdict. The Verdict is a lively discussion of current events and legal issues pertinent to Oklahomans. The Verdict is hosted by Kent Myers and Mick Cornett. It's time for The Verdict.
And welcome once again to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. We're here every Sunday morning, and this week we're discussing the Ten Commandments.
Yes, going back to our roots of The Verdict. The Supreme Court has two decisions it's going to hand down sometime soon, and as a matter of fact, folks, the decisions could come out between the day we tape this show and when it's aired. But the Ten Commandments display on public property is an issue that the Supreme Court is being asked to decide. When is it proper, when is it improper? We have a case from Texas being joined with a case from Kentucky. And we want to see how, we want to discuss the issues involved with that. And we have two preeminently qualified guests to join us today, both professors of law, both experts in constitutional law, and I might say with differing views on how the case ought to be decided, not necessarily how it will be decided, but how it ought to be decided. I think we're going to try to reconcile things like the currency display of In God We Trust and the like with the display of the Ten Commandments. It should be a very interesting show.
Yeah, some basic church and state issues.
Yep, that's exactly it.
Two good guests, too. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers, and Kent's going to introduce today's guests.
We are really pleased today to have two guests, experts in constitutional law. Across the table from me is Michael Scapperlanda, professor of law at the University of Oklahoma College of Law, teaching constitutional law, among other things. He's a University of Texas graduate, both undergraduate and law, with high honors. He was in private practice for a number of years. He's been teaching at OU for 16 years. He's done a lot of publishing of books and articles on constitutional law and other subjects. This is Michael's second visit to The Verdict. And Michael, thanks for joining us again.
Well, thank you for having me.
We're pleased you could be here. On my left is Rick Tepker, also a professor of law at the University of Oklahoma College of Law and also an expert in constitutional law. Rick graduated from Claremont College for his undergraduate degree and Duke University for his law degree, where he attained, under the undergraduate Phi Beta Kappa, and at law he was Order of the Coif, which means top 10% of your class at Duke. He's been teaching at OU for 24 years, has won the Regents Prize or Award for Superior Teaching Ability, and like Michael, has published books and articles about constitutional law, including this subject we're talking about today. This is Rick's first visit. We hope not your last. Welcome to The Verdict.
Thank you for having me.
I want to first now, let's kind of put in perspective for our viewers what we're talking about today. We're talking about the U.S. Constitution. We're talking about the separation of church and state on the display of Ten Commandments. So let's just look at the very beginning of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which provides that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, the First Amendment goes on to cover other things, but that's what we're dealing with today. Mick, how would you like to kind of start us off here?
Well, I'd like to know how we got here. I mean, Michael, obviously, we were at some point in 1789, and we kind of are familiar with where we are in 2005. I think most of us know what questions are being asked in 2005. But were those questions being asked in 1789, and how has this issue evolved to get us to where we are today?
Well, if you notice the very first word of the First Amendment, Congress, and in 1789, the First Amendment applied solely to the federal government. And some states did have established religions for some period of time. So we've come a very, very long way. George Washington, in his farewell address to the nation, said that democracy was made for only a religious and moral people, and he doubted that you could separate religion from morality over the long term. So I think we've come a long way.
Rick, how did we get here?
I think many of the same questions being asked today were asked at the founding of our country. It's true that the First Amendment applied only to the federal government until the 1920s, but the discussion about the First Amendment raised the same questions. And James Madison's arguments for Virginia's Statute of Religious Freedom that was authored by Thomas Jefferson outlined many of the basic principles that we see in the law today. Basically, Madison and Jefferson believed that government should be preserved from the influence of religious institutions, though not religion, and they also believed that religion should be kept free from the stifling, paralyzing hand of government. And that's what they meant by separation of church and state, which is a phrase Jefferson used in a letter to explain what the First Amendment was all about.
Have there been 2 or 3 points in our nation's history where this issue really became the front page, the banner headlines? What are the points in our country's history where people have isolated this issue of church versus state and said, let's look at this closely. What do we want to do here?
Well, I think there are banner headlines in our colonial history over this issue, but I think the more recent issues that you're referring to began in the 1960s when the Supreme Court ruled that drafting prayers, prescribing prayers, sponsoring prayers, organizing prayer sessions and other religious ceremonies were not a legitimate part of government. And I think when they did that, they restored, really, a first fundamental basic understanding of Establishment Clause jurisprudence to our culture.
Well, I read with some interest the discussions about the display of the Ten Commandments both in Texas and Kentucky, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but I saw thrown around here the discussion of something called a lemon test. I guess lemon is a case, but can you tell our viewers very briefly and simply what is the lemon test? Should it be used?
The case comes from Lemon versus Kurtzman, which was decided in 1973. It really asks 2 questions. What was government's purpose, and what was the effect of laws passed by state or federal governments?
About the display.
Well, in a display or funding or whatever program is being challenged as a violation of the Establishment Clause. No one likes the test. It's not really worthy of being called a test. It's really a couple of questions that you ask when you consider these cases. And Justice Scalia, I think, had his assessments right when he said it's like a ghoul in the night. We raise it from the grave when we wanted to achieve certain results, but if we don't like the results, we'll put it back into the grave where it will sleep until some more useful time.
But do you expect the lemon test to be applied by the Supreme Court in resolving these 2 Ten Commandment displays?
Well, it's interesting if you look at the briefs in the Texas case. The lemon test, or Lemon versus Kurtzman, is cited just once in each brief, and is really sort of buried among others. I mean, it's really a test, as Professor Tepker said, that it really is really honored in its breach now, I think, more than anything.
I think the essence of these 2 cases is whether government had a legitimate secular purpose in displaying the Ten Commandments, or were they engaged in essentially a religious campaign? And that really goes to the first prong of the lemon test. But once you say that, you don't have to discuss the lemon test very much. It's really a debate about what was the government's motivation.
Let's jump ahead, and I want to show our viewers a couple of instances across the country in which the Ten Commandments has been displayed publicly, and a lot of people have had discussions about it, some pro, some con, but there are differences in the way it's displayed, and there are differences in the way it's viewed. So let's first take a look at how it's displayed in Texas, and why don't you take a look at this and tell us what you see here and how this issue has been shaped in the capital city of Austin, Texas.
Well, in that case, you've got a monument that's on the state capitol grounds, along with a lot of other monuments. And as I understand it, the monument was put courtesy of Cecil B. DeMille as a way of promoting his film. He gave a number of these monuments to state capitals around the country.
Long time ago.
Long time ago. It's about 40 or 50 years ago.
So it's been sitting there that long.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. So does it matter how it's sitting?
I think context is important, but more important is motive. I think the case for the Ten Commandments is probably strongest in Texas, even though it's a standalone monument. But that's one of the problems. Are there some other close-by monuments that detract from the apparent religious message?
Michael, let's look at how it's displayed in Kentucky. And this is a case that I think has gotten a lot of attention. And tell us what we're going to see here.
Well, in Kentucky, they had as you can see, picture of the Ten Commandments hanging on a wall.
We can't tell, but that's the one to the left of the screen by itself.
That's right.
All right.
And as I understand it, after some objection was raised to it being there by itself, the state put up other symbols, the copy of the Magna Carta, a copy of the Declaration of Independence, the national motto, several other displays to kind of shroud it and I guess minimize the religious significance of the Ten Commandments.
Did it work?
I don't think so, but I mean, we know why it's there.
I think one of the problems is they passed a resolution which said the display is designed to show America's Christian heritage. And it was part of an ongoing political campaign. It was really quite a fervent dispute in Kentucky. The point was to put the Ten Commandments on the wall in order to make a religious display and to promote a religious message. And that's Kentucky's biggest problem in the case before the Supreme Court.
We're not through with this issue, but let's jump to a break and come back. We're visiting the Ten Commandments, church and state, and the relationship. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett, Kent Myers, and our guests, and we're discussing the Ten Commandments, church and state, how they've been displayed. Kent, where do you want to go now?
Well, I want to ask Michael and then ask Rick to comment about whether or not it matters that there was displayed, I guess, in Texas and in Kentucky what religious people call the Protestant version of the Ten Commandments. I understand by what I've read that there are a Catholic version, there's a Jewish version, there may be other versions. Does that harm the display where on state property a particular religion's version of the Ten Commandments is displayed and the other versions are not displayed? Does that matter?
I don't think it does matter. Basically, there are different translations of the Bible, and I think Justice Scalia had it right during oral argument in the Texas case. He said the importance here is that there's a symbolism that we have derived our heritage from a Judeo-Christian tradition, and so it really doesn't matter what version is being used if people want to express themselves by displaying the Ten Commandments, that's fine.
Rick, what do you think?
I think it matters in two ways. First, it means that there's no way to make a choice that isn't in some sense sectarian, that takes a stand based upon a point of dispute between different religions. And I think that accentuates, this is the second more basic problem, the fact that there's really no way to deny the religiosity of this sacred text. When government chooses text and elevates it to a prominent place, when there's a preferential treatment or an affirmative action for sacred text, it's gone far beyond government's normal purpose, and that is to deal with human affairs and not the affairs that belong to the divinity.
Well, in other words, taking that point, in order to make it okay, all versions would have to be displayed.
Well, I think I'd object to that as well, and I think the people who are objecting do object, but that would certainly have a better chance of passing muster. Let
me change the subject just a little bit. We know on our dollar that, and on much of our currency, I haven't seen much bigger than a dollar in a long time, but at least on our dollar we have the words "In God We Trust" and some other symbols that could be classified as religious. We know we have disputes about Christmas creches and nativity scenes and all, and yet we seem to have decisions saying that insofar as the currency is concerned, it may be okay, insofar as the Supreme Court itself opening up with a prayer about God save the United States and this honorable court, those things seem to be okay. How do we reconcile those expressions of religious affiliation with the dispute about the Ten Commandments.
Actually, I want to jump in here because I think this dovetails nicely into what you were saying about the sectarian nature. Because one of the things the first Congress did, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the day after they voted in the First Amendment, was to hire a chaplain. And the chaplain is going to be sectarian by nature. They've had Lutheran chaplains, they've had Presbyterian chaplains, I think they've had a Catholic chaplain, and so you can't get away from it. But it's been there from the beginning of our nation's history.
But what do you tell your law students about why that's okay and the Ten Commandments may not be okay? What's the difference?
I get the hard question. The history is correct.
You tell your law students to talk to Rick.
The history is correct. The legislative chaplain was endorsed in the first Congress, and the only offer that has been given by the Supreme Court to reconcile these cases is basically tradition. There's an unbroken tradition of having a legislative chaplain. To that, I would add there's some separation of powers issues as well that explain why Congress should be allowed to hire experts on any subject, including religion. But apart from that, I think the simplest answer is one that Justice Goldberg gave to me when I asked him the question a number of years ago, and he said there are just certain issues that are of such minimal significance, he said, that ought to be resolved on the principle of the law just doesn't take account of minimal issues. And there are a long series of complicated justiciability and legal technical arguments why that is so. They're not very satisfying, and they don't satisfy my students. After I finish the long lecture, longer than it will be here, they're unpersuaded, and frankly, so am I.
And so am I.
Yeah.
You know, does it matter? I hear things brought up like in the early days of the United States government, they actually held church services in the U.S. Capitol.
And there's still a chapel in the U.S. Capitol today.
Well, is that relevant to this issue?
Sure, it's relevant. It's brought up all the time. It's debated all the time. I would very much mourn the elimination of the chapel just off the rotunda. It's a beautiful spot, and it's got some historical significance. I mean, there are some important people that have knelt down there, and quite apart from the religious issue. I don't want to change that, but that more or less misses the question posed by these cases. And if you talk about these other examples, I think you have to pose this one. Suppose Texas erected a chapel on state capitol grounds with the Ten Commandments, the Sermon on the Mount, and a picture of Jesus. Would that be appropriate? And I think the answer to that is no. The reality is the Ten Commandments issue has become the focal point for a political effort trying to get government to acknowledge God on behalf of the people. That's the way the promoters say it. And that, in my view, is an illegitimate purpose, and it violates the Establishment Clause.
I think that is for reasons I'll get into in a second, is a secular purpose, and I'll explain why in a little bit.
Well, let's spend a minute and a half, each of you, talking about these two cases that the Supreme Court has been dealing with here in the spring and moving into the summer of 2005. What's your thoughts on these cases? How do you think they're going to turn out?
Well, I wanted to say very quickly that the same issue is going on in Europe, too. In the forming of the European Union and their constitution, was there going to be recognition of the Christian heritage? And they ultimately decided no, and I think that's a big mistake. The issue here, and this is not really addressed by anybody, Scalia gets the closest to it in oral argument. I think there's a vital secular purpose here, and that is to acknowledge that we are not supreme lawgivers ourselves, that there is a supreme lawgiver above us. Going back to the Declaration of Independence, we're created and endowed with certain inalienable rights by our Creator. We are not the final authority, and that's the essence of why it's so important and why the people that are advocating it want the Ten Commandments.
What's the court going to do?
I think they'll uphold
Both of them?
both of them. Yes.
And they had differing views.
Well, they'll uphold the display of the Ten Commandments.
Okay. Rick?
I think they might uphold both of them. I think the Kentucky case is more problematic, and they may strike that down because of the history associated with those displays. They had a resolution which said this is to acknowledge our Christian heritage. And unlike Mike, I don't think this is a secular purpose. This is a religious purpose. This is designed to say that religion is central, that God exists, that we should acknowledge God, that we owe duties to God. And that's directly inconsistent with what James Madison said in explaining the Bill for Religious Freedom. If I could get citizens to read one document on this subject, it would be Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance in 1785, in which he said, the relationship between God and the individual should be a personal relationship, and the individual should give to God only which the individual believes is obligatory. Government has no business getting in the way of that personal relationship. And when you have majorities using power to pass laws to promote religion, sacred text, we're violating those fundamental principles.
Mike, what would you like people to look at if they were just going to look at one document or text on this subject?
I would have them look at George Washington's farewell speech to the nation. And I don't see how this is violating anybody's religious freedom. As Scalia said, they can avert their eyes if they don't like the Ten Commandments on government ground.
Well, something's going to have to be the final word, and we'll make it that. We are out of time. We appreciate both of you coming on the show. It's been a fascinating discussion, and one we could have extended, I'm sure, most of the day. Kent and I'll be back with the final word after this. Welcome back to The Verdict, a stimulating show on the Ten Commandments and Church and State.
Yes, we have a lot of gratitude for Rick Tepker and Mike Scapperlanda coming and visiting with us about it. They are really acknowledged experts. They are colleagues at the same law school, good friends, and yet disagree on the basis of whether or not the Ten Commandments ought to be displayed on public property or not, and they each have good reasons for their views. I hope this is the kind of discussion that you're used to on The Verdict, but we're proud to bring it to you. Speaking of discussions, next week we're going to be visiting with a very different subject called the Allied Arts. The Allied Arts is something that is present in Oklahoma City and making a real difference in the lives of Oklahoma Cityans. And we're going to bring you next week a couple of people that are involved in making that happen.
We also want you to go to our website in the meantime, theverdict.tv. And when you go there, you can answer one of our poll questions, and that is, should the Ten Commandments be displayed on government property? You'll be able to say yes or no. We look forward to your response. For Kent Myers, I'm Mick Cornett, and we'll see you next week right here on The Verdict.